good morning, everybody. Hope your Tuesday is off to a good start. Today in our Bible devotion, we are in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 3. What I wrote at the top of my journal after reading and meditating on this chapter is covering up or ignoring sin is costly. Covering up or ignoring sin is costly. In this chapter, usually we focus on the part where God calls Samuel to be a prophet, and it's a beautiful story. I preached on that in the past. But what we sometimes ignore or miss, and that I really had not focused on as much in the past, is in the midst of God calling Samuel to be a prophet, God explains to Samuel his judgment on Eli in his family because of the sins of Eli's sons. And I'd always just focused on, hear my Lord, Samuel obeying God's call. But it's interesting that in the midst of God calling Samuel to be a prophet, he explains to him why his mentor and his mentor's sons and descendants will not serve in that priestly role anymore. Now, Eli already knew this was going to happen because in chapter 2, you'll remember, God had sent a man of God, an unnamed prophet, to tell Eli. And Eli submitted to that and said, whatever God deems wise, then let it be. So Eli knew about it, but it's described in chapter 3 as God tells it to Samuel in verses 11 and following. So let's look at that together. The Lord said to Samuel, behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. It's really going to get people's attention. In that day I will carry out against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him, and we read about that in chapter 2, I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever. It's not a temporary judgment. It's a permanent judgment on Eli and his family. Judge his house forever for the iniquity or the sin, which he knew. Wasn't that Eli committed the sin, but he knew about it, because his sons brought a curse on themselves. You'll remember his sons were abusing the sacrifice that people would bring to the altar. They were getting their part first rather than God getting his first. They were taking some of what the worshiper was to have back for their feast, and they were also having immoral sexual relations with some of the women who were volunteering, serving there at the tabernacle. So they were just, in fact, the Bible says they were horrible. They didn't know God, and they were just horrible. And so Eli knew about this sin, and he did not rebuke them. Verse 14, therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. God says his descendants will never serve as priests again. It's a forever, quote unquote, judgment, and there's no atonement they can make to be restored back to that privilege of serving as they had always done. Now, the part that really spoke to me when I was reading this was verse 13. When he said, I've told Eli what I'm about to do to his house, for the iniquity which he knew that his sons, committed, but he did not rebuke them. Yesterday, when we looked at chapter 2, we talked about the fact that Eli talked to his sons once, but they didn't listen to him. And then he had the authority to fix the problem by removing them from priestly duty, but he didn't do that. So he allowed them to continue abusing God's people. He allowed them to continue abusing the sacrifice and making a mockery of the worship of God there at the temple. He let it keep going, I guess, because they were his sons. I don't know, but he didn't stop it. He had the authority to remove them and stop it, but he did not do that. And it's very clearly stated he knew their sin. And we saw that yesterday in chapter 2 as well. It's reminiscent over the last few decades, of how we've become aware that whether it's in religious organizations, churches, etc., or the Boy Scouts, or educational institutions, places of employment, and even the sex abuse crisis with Larry Nassar, the doctor for the women's Olympic teams, who was also at Michigan State, and over, people know that someone's doing wrong, someone's abusing people, guilty of sex abuse, and they don't do anything. Or they quietly let them resign and maybe move them over here where they may be able to continue abusing people. I know this devotion is for Tuesday, September 13, but I'm actually recording it on Monday, August 19, and the news just broke yesterday about Matt Chandler, a prominent pastor that has to step away from his ministry for a season because, and we don't know all the details, he had some inappropriate communication with some woman via direct messaging through Instagram. And I'm sure by the time you hear this, more information will have become public. And this pattern of whether, I think sometimes people let people resign or move over here and keep it quiet for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's friendship. Sometimes it's just ignorance of how damaging this stuff really is. Maybe it's to protect the reputation of the church or the institution, the organization. It's fear of a lot of different things. A lot of different reasons, but it's reminiscent of Eli allowing his sons to continue abusing God's people. And God said, Eli, I'm judging you and all of your descendants because of that. And whatever the motivation for letting people get away with sex abuse, harassment, letting them quietly resign but not face the consequence, not dealing with it the right way, it's a sin. It's not just a bad decision. It's so much more than a bad decision. It is a sin before God, especially when we allow that to happen in the church. And so I guess in the context of what's going on in our culture today, and it's not just something within institutions, it's the society at large. People not knowing how to deal with these things, not wanting to believe victims and survivors, etc. It's wrong. And it's a sin, and every time we do it, we create more damage. Okay, when we cover it up, when we hide it, when we don't deal with it appropriately and transparently, we create more damage. Eli allowed more judgment to come on his family than would have because he refused to deal with it. And when we refuse to deal with that kind of sin, we just make things worse. It is wrong, and it is a sin. And in many cases, it's also a crime. So that's the word for today. I know it's not really exciting, but in 2022, there's no excuse for covering up sex abuse of any kind. Just no excuse. And well, that's the message for today, and I'll see you tomorrow.